January 14th, 1942. The Atlantic Ocean, less than 60 miles off the coast of North Carolina. The night is frigid, but the horizon is glowing a sickly, violent orange. A massive American tanker, the Nornis, shudders as a second torpedo from U-123 tears through her hull, venting thousands of barrels of oil into the freezing surf. From the conning tower of his submarine, Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan watches the silhouette of the sinking giant against the bright lights of the American shoreline. To his disbelief, the coastal cities are not blacked out. The boardwalks of Atlantic City and the skyscrapers of New York remain illuminated, framing the merchant ships like targets in a shooting gallery. This is the second happy time, a slaughter in the shallows where German steel meets American complacency. As the Nornis slips beneath the waves, taking her crew into the abyss, the U-boat commanders believe they are winning the war of attrition. They do not yet realize that the flickering lights on the shore aren't just targets. They're the pilot lights of an industrial furnace that is about to roar to life. In the winter of 1941, the Atlantic Ocean was not a battlefield of territory, but a battlefield of mathematics. To the high command of the Third Reich, specifically Admiral Dönitz, the war was a simple equation of tonnage. If the German U-boat fleet could sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them, the British Isles would starve, the Soviet Union would collapse without supplies, and the planned liberation of Europe would remain a fever dream. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the British Empire was already teetering on the edge of a logistical precipice. The Black Pit, a vast, mid-Atlantic gap beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, had become a graveyard for thousands of sailors and millions of tons of essential food, fuel, and munitions. The situation was dire. The United Kingdom required roughly 30 million tons of imports annually just to survive. By early 1942, they were losing hundreds of ships a month. The German strategy, the Riddle tactic or wolfpack, was systematically dismantling the convoy system. Groups of submarines would shadow a slow-moving merchant fleet by day, then surface at night to strike from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelming the few overstretched escort destroyers. For the American leadership, the realization was chilling. It did not matter how many millions of men they drafted or how many tanks they manufactured if those men and machines ended up on the floor of the Atlantic. The United States was militarily ill-prepared for this maritime onslaught. Despite the warning shots of 1939 and 1940, the U.S. Navy's destroyer fleet was focused on the Pacific after the disaster at Pearl Harbor. Along the American eastern seaboard, the U-boats operated with near impunity during the early months of 1942. This period, known as Operation Paukenschlag or Operation Drumbeat, saw a handful of German submarines sink over 600 ships in just 6 months. The American response was initially disorganized. Coastal lighting remained on, silhouetting ships for easy targeting, and the implementation of a coastal convoy system was delayed by bureaucratic friction and a lack of escort vessels. However, beneath this surface-level chaos, a transformation was beginning. The United States possessed a latent power that the Axis powers had fundamentally underestimated, an industrial infrastructure that could be standardized, scaled, and accelerated beyond anything seen in human history. The arsenal of democracy was not just a political slogan. It was a mandate for a total economic mobilization. The goal was no longer just to defend the convoys, but to outproduce the destruction. If the U-boats sank 10 ships, the Americans would build 20. This shift in focus from purely tactical defense to industrial offense marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, one where the welder's torch became as vital as the depth charge. The American response to the U-boat threat required more than just courage. It required a total reimagining of how a nation builds for war. In 1941, shipbuilding was still largely a bespoke, artisanal craft. Vessels were constructed on individual slipways, plate by plate, rivet by rivet, by highly skilled craftsmen. This process was far too slow to counter the German torpedo. The U.S. Maritime Commission, recognizing this, looked toward the concepts of mass production pioneered by the automotive industry. They needed a ship that was simple, sturdy, and above all, easy to build. The result was the EC-2S C1, better known as the Liberty ship. At its core, the Liberty ship was a dreadnought for the common man. It was 441 feet long, powered by an old-fashioned but reliable triple-expansion steam engine, and capable of carrying over 10,000 tons of cargo. The genius of the Liberty program lay in its modularity. Instead of building the entire ship in one place, various components, the bow, the stern, the deckhouses, were prefabricated in shops hundreds of miles away and shipped to the yards for final assembly. Most importantly, the shipyards moved away from traditional riveting to electric arc welding. Welding was faster, required less specialized training, and made the hulls lighter and stronger. While the shipyards were being cleared for these behemoths, the American labor force underwent a radical shift. As millions of able-bodied men were funneled into the Army and Navy, the seamen who would build and sail these ships were increasingly drawn from the civilian interior. Women, minorities, and older workers flooded into coastal cities like Richmond, California, and South Portland, Maine. These new workers weren't just building ships. They were building the infrastructure of a global superpower. By 1943, the United States had transformed from a country with a modest merchant fleet into the greatest maritime producer the world had ever seen. This industrial explosion was matched by a strategic pivot in Washington. Admiral Ernest J. King, the commander-in-chief of the United States fleet, realized that the U-boat could not be defeated by passive defense alone. The Atlantic convoy had to be supplemented by aggressive hunter-killer groups. This required a massive influx of specialized escort vessels, destroyer escorts, and small, mass-produced escort carriers. The stage was set for a collision between German tactical brilliance and American industrial weight. The German Naval Command, under Dönitz, believed they were fighting a naval war, but the Americans had turned it into a war of logistics. By late 1942, the first of the Great Bridge of ships began to stretch across the Atlantic, carrying the weight of the American economy directly into the teeth of the U-boat packs. To understand how the Atlantic was won, one must look not at the bridge of a destroyer, but at the mud-slicked yards of Richmond and Sausalito. The central figure of this industrial offensive was Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship in his life before the war. Kaiser applied the principles of the highway and dam construction he knew so well to the maritime world. He broke the ship down into 250,000 prefabricated parts. Under his watch, the traditional keel-to-mast construction time plummeted. In 1941, it took roughly 230 days to build a single merchant vessel. By 1942, Kaiser's yards were averaging 40 days. In a stunning display of industrial propaganda and genuine engineering prowess, the crew at the California Shipbuilding Corporation assembled the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. While this was a sprint for the cameras, the reality was equally terrifying for the German High Command. The Americans were launching ships faster than the U-boats could physically reload their torpedo tubes. To understand how the Atlantic was won, one must look not at the bridge of a destroyer, but at the mud-slicked yards of Richmond and Sausalito. The central figure of this industrial offensive was Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship in his life before the war. Kaiser applied the principles of the highway and dam construction he knew so well to the maritime world. He broke the ship down into 250,000 prefabricated parts. Under his watch, the traditional keel-to-mast construction time plummeted. In 1941, it took roughly 230 days to build a single merchant vessel. By 1942, Kaiser's yards were averaging 40 days. In a stunning display of industrial propaganda and genuine engineering prowess, the crew at the California Shipbuilding Corporation assembled the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. While this was a sprint for the cameras, the reality was equally terrifying for the German High Command. The Americans were launching ships faster than the U-boats could physically reload their torpedo tubes. While the Navy provided the protection, It was the civilian merchant marine who bore the brunt of the tonnage war. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were oilers, cooks, and deckhands, many of whom were teenagers or men in their 50s. Unlike the Navy, if a merchant marine ship was sunk, his pay stopped the moment he hit the water. They sailed in rusted tubs or highly volatile tankers, knowing that a single torpedo strike meant an inferno of burning oil or a slow death in a life raft. The psychological pressure was immense. In the early years, the casualty rate for the merchant marine was higher than that of any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, including the Marine Corps. Yet, after every sinking, the survivors would often sign back onto another ship within weeks. This grit was the human lubricant of the bridge of ships. Without their willingness to sail into the black pit time and again, the industrial output of the shipyards would have simply rotted on the piers of New York and Baltimore. The breaking of the German naval resistance was not just a feat of construction, but a triumph of invisible waves. By 1944, American ships were equipped with Huff-Duff HF/DF, a high-frequency direction-finding system that could triangulate a U-boat's position the second it transmitted a radio message to Berlin. The Germans, relying on their Enigma encrypted bursts, believed they were being stealthy, unaware that the Americans were listening to their locations in real time. Furthermore, the introduction of cinemetric radar, specifically the 10-centimeter SG radar, changed the nature of night combat. Older radar sets were bulky and lacked the resolution to see a small object like a U-boat conning tower or a periscope. The new American sets were so precise they could pick up a surface submarine in heavy fog or total darkness for miles away. The invisibility that the U-boat relied upon was stripped away by vacuum tubes and oscillators. For the German sailor, the ocean was becoming a house of glass. There was nowhere left to hide. The mathematical certainty that Admiral Dönitz had relied upon began to fracture in the spring of 1943. The German wolfpacks were at their peak strength, with over 100 U-boats patrolling the North Atlantic, but they were about to run headlong into the full, synchronized might of the American industrial machine. The climax of this struggle, the decisive turning point, is known to history as Black May. In early May 1943, the battle centered on convoy ONS-5. A slow-moving fleet of 43 merchant ships was intercepted by a massive wolf pack of 30 German submarines. In the driving rain and gale-force winds of the North Atlantic, a brutal, multi-day melee ensued. Initially, the Germans had the upper hand, sinking 12 ships. But the American response was no longer the disorganized scramble of 1942. The convoy was now protected by a sophisticated shield and sword tactic. While the escort destroyers pinned the U-boats down with new, forward-throwing Hedgehog mortar bombs, the first American hunter-killer groups, anchored by the escort carrier USS Bogue, closed the air gap from above. The result was a slaughter of the predators. In that single month of May 1943, the Germans lost 41 U-boats, nearly 25% of their operational strength in the Atlantic. This was a loss rate that even the most fanatical German commanders knew was unsustainable. The tonnage war had been flipped on its head. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz was forced to admit the unthinkable. He ordered his boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic to avoid total annihilation. The bridge of ships had held, and the path to the European continent was finally being cleared. The American shipyards had not just replaced the losses, they had overwhelmed them. By the summer of 1943, for every ship the Germans managed to sink, the United States was launching nearly 10 new ones. The logistical spine of the Third Reich was snapping under the sheer weight of American steel. The sea lanes that had been the graveyard of the Atlantic were being transformed into a high-speed conveyor belt for the upcoming invasion of Europe. By the start of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had ceased to be a struggle for survival and had become a demonstration of absolute dominance. The American shipyards were now operating at a tempo that defied military precedent. This was the era of the overlord buildup, a period where the Atlantic was so saturated with Allied hulls that German reconnaissance pilots reported the ocean looked like it was covered in a single, solid sheet of gray paint. The climax of this period was the operational perfection of the hunter-killer group. No longer content with merely defending convoys, the U.S. Navy formed Task Group 22.3, led by Captain Daniel Gallery aboard the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. On June 4, 1944, just 2 days before the D-Day landings, this group achieved a feat that symbolized the total reversal of fortunes: the capture of U-505. After being depth-charged to the surface, the German crew abandoned ship, but American sailors performed a daring boarding maneuver, seizing the vessel before it could scuttle. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological decapitation. The Americans didn't just sink the enemy, they captured their technology, their codebooks, and their pride. Meanwhile, in the ports of the UK, the bridge of ships had delivered over 1.5 million American troops and 16 million tons of cargo. The sheer volume of equipment, trucks, tanks, shells, and fuel was so immense that parts of the English coast were literally sinking into the mud under the weight. The German naval resistance had been broken by a combination of high-tech attrition and low-tech abundance. By mid-1944, the U-boats were relegated to suicide missions near the French coast, unable to interfere with the massive artificial mulberry harbors being towed across the channel. The tonnage war was over. The math had been settled. The American seamen, backed by the American welder, had secured the ocean, ensuring that when the gates of Fortress Europe were finally kicked in, the men doing the kicking would have an inexhaustible supply of boots, bullets, and bread. The collapse of the German naval effort was as sudden as it was absolute. By the autumn of 1944, the once feared U-boat arm was a shadow of its former self. Admiral Dönitz's strategy of area pursuit, where submarines roamed freely to find targets, had been rendered impossible. The German Navy was forced to retreat from its fortified megapens in Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire as Allied ground forces swept across France. The hunters were now hiding in the deep fjords of Norway or the coastal waters of the Baltic, terrified to surface. The statistical reality of the aftermath was staggering. Between 1939 and 1945, the Germans built 1,162 U-boats. They lost 783 of them. Of the 40,000 men who serve in the German submarine force, 30,000 never returned, a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of any military in the war. This was the price of challenging the arsenal of democracy. While the German industry struggled under the weight of Allied strategic bombing, the American shipyards were still accelerating. In the final count, American yards had produced over 2,700 Liberty ships and 500 larger, faster Victory ships. For the German High Command, the failure was not just military, but systemic. They had banked on a short, sharp conflict where high-quality tactical units could achieve decisive results. They had not prepared for a prolonged war of attrition against a continental power that could treat ship production like the assembly of a Ford Model T. The steel tide had not just pushed the U-boats back, it had buried them. By the end of 1944, the Atlantic was so safely under Allied control that insurance rates for merchant shipping, once astronomical, plummeted to near pre-war levels. The ocean was no longer a barrier, it was a highway. The economic and psychological toll on the Third Reich was profound. By 1944, the failure to sever the Atlantic lifeline meant that the German army was facing a material Schlacht, a war of material that it could never win. For every German Tiger tank that reached the front, the bridge of ships delivered 10 Shermans. For every gallon of synthetic fuel the Germans scrambled to produce, American tankers poured thousands into the European theater. The logistical superiority was so absolute that it fundamentally altered the German soldier's psyche. They were no longer fighting an army, but a factory. The destruction of the U-boat fleet also meant the loss of Germany's primary strategic intelligence tool. Without submarines to scout the Atlantic, the German High Command was blind to the movements of the Allied Western Task Forces. This blindness was a direct contributor to the success of the deception operations surrounding D-Day. The arsenal of democracy had created a curtain of steel that the aware could not peer through. Beyond the military collapse, the aftermath saw a radical shift in the global maritime order. The British merchant navy, which had dominated the waves for centuries, emerged from the war exhausted and depleted. In its place stood the United States, possessing the largest merchant and naval fleet in human history. The Liberty and Victory ships didn't just win the war. They provided the immediate logistical framework for the Marshall Plan, carrying the food and building materials that would eventually reconstruct a shattered Europe. The ships that had been built to survive torpedoes were now repurposed to revive economies. The American shipyards had effectively overbuilt for the war, creating a surplus of shipping that ensured American goods would dominate global markets for a generation. The German naval resistance hadn't just been broken. It had been replaced by a new era of American maritime hegemony. In the quiet of the post-war years, the hulks of the Liberty ships began to disappear. Some sold to emerging nations to jumpstart their trade, others scrapped for the very steel that had once been forged in the heat of 1942. But the legacy of what happened in those American shipyards remains etched into the foundation of the modern world. The breaking of the German naval resistance was more than a series of depth-charge attacks or tactical maneuvers. It was the moment history transitioned from the era of the warrior to the era of the engineer. The Atlantic was not won by a single heroic general or a secret weapon, but by the collective, rhythmic motion of millions of hammers, torches, and pens. It was won by the daughter of a sharecropper in a Georgia shipyard and by the merchant sailor who watched 3 ships sink beneath him and still signed on for a 4th. They proved that a free society, when pushed to the brink, could outthink, outbuild, and outlast the most disciplined military autocracy. The bridge of ships changed the very geography of power. By 1944, the Atlantic was no longer a moat separating the new world from the old. It had been paved over with steel. This victory established the blueprint for modern global logistics. The idea that any amount of material could be moved anywhere on Earth, provided you had the industrial will to make it so. When we look at the vast container ships that dominate the oceans today, we are seeing the direct descendants of the Liberty ships. Ultimately, the story of the American shipyards is a reminder that the true strength of a nation lies not in its capacity to destroy, but in its capacity to create. The U-boats offered a masterpiece of technical destruction, but they were silenced by a masterpiece of human production. The Atlantic became an American lake not because of a desire for empire, but because the alternative was a world in darkness, a darkness that was held back, one welded plate at a time.